it goes back to exactly the quote I talked about in the beginning. When you're accustomed to privilege, equality feels like oppression, right? And so when you say, why should I be penalized? You're not being penalized.
Yeah.
There is no oppression, right?
Right.
We get to each have access. John and Jane both get a call back for the interview.
Right.
Right?
Is that so wrong? When you see it from that perspective,
Right.
is that so unfair?
Right. John's not being penalized for having 10 books in the home.
Mm-hmm.
And Jane's not being penalized for being born without a penis.
That's just a quick snippet of my conversation this week with Laurie VandeSchoot about women in leadership. My name is Ben Charland. This is What on Earth is Going On, your weekly podcast for a world in flux. Before we get to it, I wanted to ask you a favor. If you like this show, please spread the word. Tell your friends, go onto social media, spread it that way, give it a rating on iTunes or whatever podcast app that you use, and please reach out to me as well. You can email me at wogoshow@gmail.com, that's WOEGO show@gmail.com, or the website is wogoshow.com. Go there, get links to social media, spread the word that way. And I'd love to hear your suggestions for future shows, topics, people you want to have on the show, or feedback on what you think the show is so far. I'd love to hear from you. Now, I'm quite excited about this week's episode featuring Laurie VandeSchoot, a senior public servant at the City of Calgary. Laurie is someone who has spent a lot of time thinking and delivering on diversity and inclusion, but she's also someone that I personally respect quite a bit. I've been looking forward to speaking with her for a long time. Laurie and I talk about women in leadership, about privilege and how losing privilege can feel like you're being oppressed. We talk about allies and the need to have allies in the workplace and at home. We talk about leadership, the qualities of leadership, and why leaders really are the one thing that can change the status quo. We talk about male privilege and white privilege. We talk about how this all isn't just about women. This is really about men too. But there's one thing that we talked about that really gave me pause. I spend a lot of time on this show talking about history, about the past, about the forces at play in the world and how they led us to where we are. I get quite excited about this subject because I think I can see what's happening from a 30,000-foot view or from 50 years from now if I imagine myself looking back. The problem with doing that is, though, that I miss what's really going on. Laurie said something to me. She stopped me in my tracks in this interview, and you're going to hear it in just a moment. I was asking her, well, what are the forces that led us to where we are? It was an important question, and I think she understood the importance of the question. But she was able to tell me something that was even more important. Why don't we just fix it? If we know that it's a problem, why don't we just fix it? Rather than spending all of this time deliberating, which can be important. We all know how important it is to know something and to understand something, to get behind it and to the bottom of it. But sometimes some things just need to be fixed. And for that, among many other reasons, I really appreciated this conversation with Laurie VandeSchoot. I hope you do too.
All right, Laurie VandeSchoot, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Ben.
So you're a senior leader in the public administration of the City of Calgary, and I've known you for years now, and I've found that you've got some great insight, not only into how government works and how a leader in the public sector can be most effective, but I think you've got a great insight into women in leadership, a really critical discussion that we're having right now in our society in Canada and where you're from in Calgary, although we're talking here actually in Toronto. So before we get into all of that, or maybe you can get into it with your answer to this first question, because it's always my first question of every guest. Laurie, what on earth is going on?
Well, thanks, Ben. I think that we have, a crisis of leadership. I think that we have, a good, 52 or 50.2, or how about women make up just over half of the Canadian population, and yet they continue to be underrepresented in political venues, in leadership venues, and in leadership positions across Canada. I don't think the city of Calgary is any different than the city of Toronto or the federal government. And so, and yet what we know is that as women ascend to leadership, they become amazing role models for girls. And I love this story about there's two female senators in California, and they're the only, and they were friends, and so their young daughters were friends, and so their young daughters had, because their mothers had each served 2 terms, so
Right.
8 years, and so these 2 children had only ever known their 2 mothers as senators.
Huh.
And so when the next election came up, and a man was running for state senate in California, and the daughter looks at her mother and says, "But Mom, boys can't be senators." Because in her entire experience, only 2 women had ever been senators in California.
Right.
And for me, and we laugh at that story, and you've laughed at that story because it is so absurd,
Yeah.
right? And yet, there are girls and boys everywhere who look and say, well, girls can't be prime minister, girls can't be premier, girls can't be CEO, because they've only ever seen boys in those roles, right?
Right.
And so we need boys and girls to see women and men in these kinds of leadership positions, right? And
just as an aside to this, there's a friend of mine who works for Air Canada, right here out of Toronto, and she's a pilot. And she has had experiences where people, I don't know if they actually in the end refused, but they almost refused to get on board the aircraft. In fact, I'm pretty sure they refused. They said, "I can't be on this plane.
Right.
A woman is piloting it." And I mean, now in 2018, that's absurd. What are you talking about? I mean, why not just judge whether if it's a man? Why not just decide, well, he's got a beard, he can't possibly be the pilot of my aircraft, or he's got brown eyes, or he's wearing a certain kind of sneaker. Like, what are you talking about? But we also know that there are historical forces at play when we're talking about women in leadership and the roles that men and women have. That's probably the most obvious thing I could say about this. But it's a segue to my question for you, which is, where does all this come from? So for these 2 daughters, they have a very different and very forward-looking perspective of the world, even though it's the opposite problem that we have. But where does the sense that is absurd come from? In our history, in our society, in our culture? How did we get here?
Yeah, that's a very complicated question.
And I know, and it's a long question too, because we're going back through 200,000 years of human history. I know that, but to put too fine a point on it, it's important to understand where we are in order to understand where we're going. And the only way to do that is to figure out how we got here, and what are the forces at play that caused these issues. So, for example, 50.2% of all of the population are women, but a much smaller proportion of that are in positions of leadership. So why has that happened? Why are we there?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, I think that right now in Fortune 500 companies, we see less than 20% of positions held by women. We see that less than about 8% of the highest paid positions in Canada are women. We have a federal cabinet who's now equally, there's gender equity there, but only 27-ish% of MPs are women, and so you're right. I mean, we have this historical background, and let me go to Genesis chapter 1 verse 1 and start from there, right? Like, I mean, there was something about a rib. I don't know.
Something about a rib. Maybe that's verse 4 or something.
Yeah.
But in the beginning, essentially, is what you're getting at. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, I value what you're saying around, if you don't know where you're going, you have to know the past in order to be able to. But by the same token, do you really? I mean, I'm not sure that I have. I mean, I think we all understand that women have been subjugated for millennia, right? And in many places continue to be. But do I really need to know that in order to be able to say, because we intuitively know it's not right, right? We intuitively know equity and equality and systemic barriers and all of those things.
Right.
And so can't we just fix it?
Right.
right?
And I think you're making a really solid point there, because I think it's not just about, well, we know what it has looked like in the past, and we know what kind of future we want to build. I think it's actually much more simpler than that. There have been studies recently with chimpanzees, and if a chimpanzee feels that his chimpanzee friend, or his whether it's his brother or cousin or just another chimpanzee, is being treated unfairly or unequally right next to him in another cage right next door, he will get upset because he feels that something is wrong, that there is unfairness. That is a moral issue at play, even in chimpanzees. Morality is not confined to the human species. And I think what you're saying is that this is a very basic issue of fairness that we can all understand, that we would have understood it 500 years ago or 10,000 years ago just as much as we understand it today. If someone 500 years ago can see that 50% of the population is women, and yet women are subjugated and mistreated every day, I think people must have innately known that this isn't quite right, even if the system is propagated for decades and decades and centuries and millennia. We must know deep down inside that there's something wrong with that. Now, maybe there's an anthropologist or a sociologist or a historian who would totally disagree with that, but that seems to me to be a pretty valid assumption, that we know what unfairness looks like, and it's almost impossible to hide it. You can mask it, you can put lipstick on a pig, but it's still a pig. And that's a fair assessment, I think, of our history. But another point that we're getting to when we talk about women in roles of leadership and talking about establishing equality and equity in our society is the question of progress. And my question to you is, has it been getting better over the last century or 50 years or 10 years or even just the last year, if we're talking about, say, the Me Too movement? Are things getting better? Are we seeing progress? Or do we seem to be facing the same old problems over and over again, just in maybe new clothes?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question, because I think you talk about this notion of fairness, but I think you have to counterbalance that with the notion about power and privilege, right? I think that, that we all innately understand privilege, right? We all carry some amount of privilege, right? There are rights or advantages or that I have being white, and that other members of our society don't have, right? There
or
are
even privileges that you have being human over animals, right?
That's right. Yeah. But and rights and privileges and advantages that you have by your gender, right?
Sure.
The fact that you're a white male, we could, and we've all YouTubed the privilege game, and and we all understand how that works, right?
Yeah, right.
And so, there are members of our society that just aren't starting at the same starting line, right?
Yeah.
And so, I love that quote, and I'd have to look it up, but it's that quote about how when you're used to privilege, or losing privilege feels like oppression.
Right?
Yeah,
right.
This good friend of mine, he's a football player, very large man, happens to work in emergency services, so wears a uniform, right? And so he tells the story about how he walks down the street, and in fact this happened to me. So but anyway, so he's walking down the street, and every time he walks down the street, people just move out of his way. Right?
Right, because he's
He's
a
very large man in a uniform. He's white. He's Anglo-Saxon. He's
checking every box.
Correct, right?
Get out of my way.
Right.
Yeah,
He's walking down the street, and he's used to people getting out of his way, right? So as you know, I also wear a uniform, and I walk down Stephen Avenue in Calgary, and I'm used to people getting out of my way.
Right.
One day I'm walking down Stephen Avenue and I don't have my uniform on, and all of a sudden, people are in my way. They're bumping into me, and they're I gotta,
Really?
excuse me. And and it took me back, what's going on? It's and it took at least a half an hour for my brain to go, oh my God, I'm not wearing my uniform today. And so I'm not carrying that privilege, right? all of a sudden I don't have this societal thing that says you have privilege, therefore I will step out of your way because you have higher rank or status or advantage, right?
I could almost imagine that in that situation you could feel oppressed.
Correct.
By that
right?
change. Yeah.
That's right. So all of a sudden I'm like, why is everyone like, I'm being persecuted today. Everyone's bumping into me. Everybody's like, and all of a sudden I'm feeling, big stretch here to say oppressed, but certainly I'm feeling infringed upon.
Yeah.
Right. And so imagine other, kinds of advantages that you might be used to that all of a sudden you don't have that anymore. And so all of a sudden it's feeling like oppression, right? And so we as humans don't like to give up our privilege.
Right.
Right? We all like to get to the front of the line faster. We all like to have some sort of special discount or some sort of advantage.
Right.
I think it's just the human condition, I think.
Yeah. This is, I know this might sound surprising, but I don't think I've had anyone put so fine and acute a point on what on earth is going on than what you just said. And the reason I say that is because when I asked that question, so when I first started this show a few months ago, I thought if I had asked anybody the question, what on earth is going on 5 years ago, they'd have no idea what I'm talking about. They would say, with what? Right. What on earth is going on with my toilet? Right. What on earth is going on with my elections, my water, whatever. I ask that question now and people invariably know generally what I'm getting to. They know I'm getting to Brexit, Donald Trump, populism, the internet, Facebook. They know I'm talking about the disturbance, the flux that we feel that we're living in. And a lot of people have tried to figure out, how did Donald Trump get elected back in 2016? It's a big question. It's one of the subjects that can't help but be raised on this show in almost every single episode. It sucks up all the oxygen in the room. But people ask this question, why did this happen? And I've heard a lot of people talk about the revanchism amongst white Americans, feeling that their government has betrayed them in favor of immigration, and they don't want to give up their country to non-whites, and they think that their country belongs to a older 20th century or 19th century or 18th century white Christian ideal and male ideal as well. And they think that this is slowly being evaporated, and they've been betrayed by the so-called liberal elites. But it's much more simpler and plainly psychological than that. My privilege is being taken away, so to speak, quote unquote, and therefore I feel like I'm being oppressed by someone who looks different from me, or by someone who's a different gender than I am, or by someone who wants to have a unisex bathroom, for example. I mean, all of these things are stripping away at what I thought belonged to me. So when many of these voters of Donald Trump talk about entitlement and how minorities feel entitled, well, if you think about it, where is the true entitlement lying in this equation? Mm-hmm. It's often lying with those who have had privilege before. Mm-hmm. So what do you make about this? I mean, I know I'm taking it to a much higher level than where we started the conversation. I'm talking about populism and Donald Trump and white nationalism, not just in the United States, but all over the world. Do you think that this is a fair connection that I'm drawing? Do you think that this is, in part, what on earth is going on?
Yeah, so I would say, without doubt, that is, in my view, what is going on.
Right.
And so I think specific to, some of my issues, I think that then translates to women in leadership, right? I have been in meetings where, I was a finance manager managing, $6 billion worth of assets, and I had a 23-year-old male, sitting in a meeting with lots and lots of people, explaining to me, and let's be clear, mansplaining to me how to do a $3,000 budget. And everybody in the room is looking at him. Other people in finance were looking at him, and he without doubt believed he was right.
Yeah.
And everybody knows that, my experience, my background.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. And here's this guy, without a doubt, believed 100% he was right. I don't know if it's, the genetic or whatnot, but I watch my son at 6 years old who believes without a doubt that he knows everything.
Right.
Right?
Right.
I don't need to go take martial arts lessons because I already know how to do that, Mama. And so I'm just going to go on in the ring and I'm going to fight because I know how to do the spin because I watched Karate Kid.
Right.
Right? And then it's like, wow, that's incredible.
I would say two things to that. First of all, there is a silver lining to the story you just told about, the boardroom or the meeting, that the rest of the room acknowledged what was going on. Like the rest of the...
Did they? Because nobody stopped him.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah, okay. You're right. Because although they acknowledged it, they did nothing.
Right.
Okay, yeah.
Right.
And the other point I wanted to make was, and this is something I've actually faced with this show and programming this show and asking people to come on. I'll just say it flat out. The first 10 episodes of this show are all men, older, mostly white men. That was a problem that I recognized from the beginning. I felt that I didn't have the time or the resources to correct it right away, and I've spent a lot of effort trying to, I don't want to say I wanted to fix it, but I want to bring a strong diversity of voices to this show, and I feel that if I'm getting 10 out of 10 men, I'm losing the battle. Like, I'm really not getting the voices that I need to hear. But in my efforts to get a lot of women onto the show, I've come up against a lot of resistance. I have emailed probably for every man that I've invited on the show, I probably invited 3 to 4 women in the exact same way with the same kind of email. So maybe part of the problem is the way I construct the email. Maybe part of the problem is in the way this show is structured. And so if you listen to it, might sound like maybe a male-dominated show. I don't know. But what I often find is that if many women don't get back to me, and when they do, they're much more cautious about appearing on the show. Many men who respond to my request interview will simply say, sure, let's do it. What time and when? And then it's done. And I don't have to explain myself, and we just go off and do it. And there's a lot less resistance. And so for me, if I'm not thoughtful about this, I'm just going to get men all the time because it's just so easy to do. I don't have to explain myself. I don't have to answer questions about what the show's going to be about and try to maybe explain that there aren't any risks in this way. And there's just a lot of caution because many women who do respond say, well, here are my issues. Here are my questions. Can you address them before I agree to come on the show? It seems to me, and maybe I'm wrong, but there's a corollary here between what you just said about your 6-year-old son, which is that the men are simply thinking, I don't need training. I don't need any questions. I can do this. I'm good. Do you think that whether it's a genetic issue or whether it's a learned behavior, do you think that this is part of what's at play? That there's this, I don't want to call it excess caution, but a different use of caution, a different exercise of caution. And I don't mean to just make my example the only one, but I think this is well documented. There was an article in the New York Times just a few days ago saying that one of the things that holds women back in the workplace is not jumping up to take on opportunities. And I can understand, maybe I'm talking too much here, and I'll let you jump in a second, but do you think that this is part of the issue when we're talking about women in leadership? And if it is, what do we do about it?
Yeah, I think you raise a really, really important point, and I'm not entirely sure it's gender. I have absolutely no idea, because I also know some, men who have personalities who also don't put up their hand,
absolutely,
right?
Yeah.
And I know some women with some personalities who absolutely put up their hand.
Hey, to be clear, many men didn't respond to me either.
Yeah. I love this initiative that's going on in Calgary. It's a not-for-profit in Calgary called Ask Her. Are you familiar with that?
Absolutely, yeah.
And the kind of the premise of that is that so it's based on some initial research that came out of Harvard that said that when a job posting comes out, so just a normal job posting, men, now this is Harvard research, not mine, but men will look at that posting, and if they have about 50% of the qualifications, then they will apply, and that they feel that, I'm good, I'll take my shot.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah.
The research shows that women, overwhelmingly, would not apply unless they had between 90 and 100% of the qualifications.
Wow.
And so just at its root, right? Now, there are exceptions to every one of those rules, and you find men and women on both sides of that. Mm-hmm. But at its root, women will only apply if they got 90 to closer to 100% of the qualifications, which says, oh, yes, I have every one of those things, I'll put my name in.
Right.
Men will apply if they have 40 to 50% of the qualifications because, I'm probably good enough, right? And I can fake it till I make it on the rest, right? Or whatever.
And there can even be virtue to that. Oh, yeah, you're ambitious, or
That's right.
Yeah, right.
That's right, yep. And so the Ask Her movement, and so there's that piece of research that says women just won't run for politics because they just don't believe they're qualified, or, and I shouldn't, and again, not all women, right? But another piece of research said that men will look at opportunity and put their hand up. And they'll say, oh, yeah, I could do that. Oh, I could be a politician. I could be an MLA. I could be an MP.
Yeah.
They'll put their hand up. They'll campaign. They'll put that up. Overwhelmingly, women will not seize opportunities unless they are personally asked by someone they trust. And so the Ask Her movement is about invigorating the community to ask women to run for politics. And run for local government, municipal government, provincial or federal government. And in the last election, twice as many women ran as we'd seen in previous elections, right?
Right.
Which is not about quotas, and it's not about all of those, things. It is still about meritocracy, because it's still about, who the electorate elects.
Right. Right.
But if you don't even see a woman on the ballot, then it's not even an option, right?
Of course.
And so I don't remember how we got there, but what we were talking about, what your question was. But I think...
You don't need to know, just keep going.
but I think Ask Her is a really interesting example. And so when I translate that to women in leadership, I recently put out a posting for a senior position in the department or the municipality, and every single solitary applicant was male.
Wow.
And so I went and talked to the next most senior person who is qualified, who is positioned, who we've mentored, and why didn't you apply? Well, nobody asked me. If they really wanted me, they would have phoned me, and they would have asked me.
Wow.
And when I took that back to my leadership team, which is 17 men and me, and when I said to them, this was the response, they all looked at me and said, well, why would we phone her?
Right.
Why would we phone anyone? We put out the posting, and if you want to apply, apply.
Right.
Right? It did not even occur to them. And yet when I think back, the last senior leader female that we hired, we asked her. And she will tell me this to this day. I never would have applied if, you and you and you hadn't come to my office and had a conversation with me and said, we believe in you. We believe you can do this job. And so there's this, I think I don't know if it's psychology or I'm not sure what that's about, but, what is that whole, how do you be an active ally, right?
Yeah.
Because I think that lots of men are amazing allies, right?
Sure.
I have some amazing allies in my life. But what's the difference between just being a philosophical ally and an active ally?
Yeah.
Right? And
talk versus walk, really.
That's right.
Yeah.
I remember one day, so as I said, 17 men in my leadership team and myself. And so I walked in one day, and one of the men in the room, one of the men on the team, he came up to me and he said, Laurie, I want you to know, I am your ally. Okay. That was really weird. Thank you. Appreciate that.
Yeah.
And he left the room. Okay. And it was a weird moment, right?
Yeah.
But psychologically, what that did for me it was groundbreaking. Because every time I walked into a meeting and he was there, I knew I had an ally.
Yeah.
I didn't have to wonder if I didn't have an ally. I didn't have to question whether or not, is anyone going to back me up if I bring up this harebrained idea? Right?
Right. And you didn't have to play a game either. You didn't have to say, well, in order to get him as an ally, I have to do X, Y, Z. No, you knew going in he was your ally.
That's right. And so every meeting I went in that he was in, I walked in with a level of confidence that I hadn't had before, right? And he did nothing different. So he wasn't different, but I was different, right? And so there's this whole notion of what is an active ally, right? And so, and so my story about the guy who mansplained, when nobody in the room stops him, I don't have any power, right? I don't have the power in the room, and I got 17 men. Nobody stops him,
right?
And so nobody, and yet I know there are men in that room who are my ally, right? I know there are men who, back me up,
absolutely,
right?
Yeah.
But when no one puts their hand up, right?
Yeah, then that's just a philosophical ally, really.
I love this story about Barack Obama's staff that had some women on it, and because and so they kind of made this intentional pact with each other that they would begin the process of what in conversations called scaffolding, right? Because often what happens is someone will come up with an idea and it gets no traction at the table, right? Or they get talked over, or 10 minutes later, then Bob brings up the idea and it's the smartest thing anyone's ever heard, right?
Thanks, Bob.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or, Susie is speaking and somebody speaks over her and those sort of thing. And so Barack Obama's staff came up with this process of scaffolding where the women intentionally made an intentional decision to support each other. And so if Susie was speaking and got interrupted, then Jane would say, "Oh, sorry, Susie wasn't done yet."
Right.
Or, "Susie, love that idea. What if we also did this?" And so they started this process. And so some friends of mine in Calgary, we'd heard about this. And so on a different leadership team, there was only 2 women on a leadership team of 10 men. And the women decided to do this. And so these 2 women started this process. And all of a sudden it started making space for their voice. Right? Because their voices are quieter. Their voices are more silent. They're more subdued. They're more subjugated.
Right.
And so they started, because the 2 voices and the power of that, right? And so, and so in my case, when my ally was my declared ally, he would do the same thing, right? And he would make space, right? And he would create those conversations. And so, when you often talk about, well, what can I do? I'm not in charge of hiring. It's like, no, you're not. But what can you do, right?
Yeah.
And so one of the things that I really appreciated about, your conversation, your example a minute ago, was recognizing your own bias, right? Because I think we all hold conscious and unconscious biases, right? And some things are easier, right?
Yeah.
It's easier to, this guy responded, this woman didn't.
Absolutely.
And, I got to work harder to get her on the show. So,
and it would be easy, I think, in a room, if someone is mansplaining over somebody else, to just let it okay, I'd rather not.
That's right.
I'd rather not put myself out there. I'd rather not be an active ally. As long as she still thinks I'm an ally in name only or philosophically, okay, that's a victory for me. Yeah. But I just wanted to add something to all that, which is that I think what you're saying also can change culture over time. So if you have 2 women on a 12-person team, and they start to take action in this respect and start standing up for one another and reinforcing each other's voice in that room. I don't know if this is true, but I'd imagine that the men in the room might start to pick up on that and might start to share in that, and therefore start to change the culture of that work environment. Because if I'm sitting at that table, I might say, you know what, I'm going to make sure that she gets a chance to speak as well, because it's made easier because the first person has already broken the ice. And they've shown me that it's actually not that difficult, and that it doesn't stir the pot so much. In fact, it's quite a positive thing, because otherwise, what's the point of having this person at the table if we're only ever going to talk over them? And really, what's the point?
And I'm not sure they're intentionally talking over. Like I have to believe it's not an intentional act, right? I mean, maybe it is, and maybe there's just some, brutal folks out there. But I fundamentally believe that it's not intentional. Right? That we're good humans who aren't intentionally trying to subjugate somebody. Right?
I didn't intend for my first 10 episodes to be men.
Right.
But that is what happened, and that was partly the result of my own bias.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and in this example, and so in Calgary we have a council of 15, and 3 of those are women, right? And so I was speaking with one of our counselors recently, and they've adopted this scaffolding technique as well.
Yeah.
And I think what was most fascinating to me is that of those 3 women, one is arguably very right wing, and one is arguably quite left wing. And you know who I'm talking about, but
I think so.
what I loved about it is that women can support each other regardless of their values and beliefs, right? So a left wing can support a right wing's leadership without agreeing with their fundamental political values.
Right.
Right?
Right.
That supporting women in leadership isn't about supporting whether or not I think that their right wing platform is right or wrong. Right? And so that is my favorite part of that story, is that so you think about those 2 politicians, because you would typically look at it and go, right wing, left wing, they will never support each other.
Yeah, you assume that their biases are set.
Correct.
And they're on opposite. Yeah.
Correct. But what can happen when we say, I value enough that your opinion is okay. Your political beliefs are okay. But I still believe in you as a woman in leadership, and I'm going to help you get there.
Right.
Regardless of whether or not I believe. Right?
This sounds to me like not just a solution to sexism in the workplace or women in leadership, but also a solution to a lot of political problems and polarization that we're experiencing, or a potential bridge, so to speak. If we can realize that there's a greater good to be achieved in our dialogues, whether they're really heated political debates or we're on opposite sides of how we should spend money to revamp the road outside of our home, or in our community. I think that if we can find the bridge that is, let's make sure that these voices are heard and make sure that we aren't, maybe even without knowing it, subduing and subjugating women or anybody based on their gender at the meeting or in a community town hall or generally in our politics. And I think that there's maybe a silver lining to this, that if we can figure out women in leadership, we might almost as a byproduct figure out a lot of the solutions to a lot of other problems. And a corollary to this is Christopher Hitchens. I don't know if you know who he is, but he died in around 2011, I think. But he would consistently say, when he was asked, what's the solution to famine and poverty and lack of education in the third world, whether it's sub-Saharan Africa or in Asia or Haiti or anywhere in the world you want to pick where there's poverty and systemic long-term poverty. And he, without really variation, he said, the empowerment of women. If you figure that out, then you will unlock economic potential. You will ease social malaise. You will solve problems with disease, because it all starts there. And I know they're 2 totally different things that we're talking about. But what I'm trying to get at is that the byproducts of success in women in leadership and achieving gender equity and pay equity are more than just feeling good about ourselves and more than just fairness. There are huge payoffs in other aspects of society that we might even not be able to imagine yet. Do you think that's fair, or am I maybe making too big of a point of this?
Well, I mean, I think the research has been clear when we look in international development globally. I think all the research says that exact same thing.
Right.
We've seen it time and time again. I think we recognize there's a difference between equity and equality, and I think that you are fundamentally correct that if you asked me what is necessary for change, I'm going to tell you every single time leadership. Right. We need people to lead this.
Right.
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 But to quote a very dear friend of mine, she says we actually need 3 things for this to change, right? We need humility, because I think we need to have that humbleness, right? We need to say, okay, so I'll acknowledge my power and privilege, right? And so am I willing to share it, right? And I always say it's not pie. Like if I get some, you don't lose some.
Yeah.
right? Like
Yeah.
we can all have advantages, right?
Yeah.
And how do you have that humbleness or that humility to say it's okay, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
She talks about how, the second thing we need is to be curious, right?
Right.
To think about curiosity and to look for areas where change is possible, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the third thing she says is we need courage. And I think for me, that's a really big piece as well, because when you talk about what on earth is going on, we've got a lot of folks without courage, right? Who don't have the courage to ask the question, to stand up, to be the voice, to be an active ally or an active bystander or any of those kinds of things, right?
Mm-hmm.
And, we had a shooting in Toronto here last week, and, how someone had the first thought that they had was to shoot a video of, someone being gunned down and put it on Facebook.
Yeah.
That was the very first thing that came to your mind, right?
Yeah.
And that's not the kind of courage I'm talking about, right?
Yeah.
And so for me, I like that kind of paradigm,
Mm-hmm.
and because I think those are really important pieces for me.
Well, and you're not just talking about women in leadership here. You're talking about leadership.
Mm-hmm.
Humility, courage, and curiosity are
Mm-hmm.
fundamental aspects, if not the fundamental aspects of leadership. And I also appreciate that you as a leader, when you're asked, what's the problem, that your response is leadership. And in a way, you're taking responsibility. You're saying, I, as part of the class of leadership, are not doing well enough to address these problems, whether because you're not humble enough, not curious enough, or not courageous enough. Whereas I think that that's a mark of a good leader, as opposed to someone who is always ready to blame something or someone else. So what's wrong? Well, people aren't voting correctly, or people aren't listening properly, or people aren't doing the research, or people aren't working hard enough, or whatever it is. All of those things, a leader believes that all of those things can be corrected or morphed through good leadership. And I don't think we have any evidence to the contrary of that. I think that's almost a truism, that leadership can solve almost all problems. And to the problem of equity in the workplace, we're talking about leadership being necessary.
Yeah, absolutely. But, I think that, one of the things I often talk about is that if you're going to walk this path, it's not easy. And it hurts. Because not everyone's going to be your friend. And not everyone's going to like you.
Right.
We recently did a survey, and well over half of the respondents actually wrote in comments. And when you're doing a survey on diversity and inclusion, and how, I certainly have their attention. It's hard to say, or obvious to say. And there was some hard comments to read in there. It's some tough stuff. They're not big fans of mine, right?
Like personal stuff?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. But I get it, right? I'm on the front end of this strategic plan that's saying that diversity and inclusion is a value, and we're going to create this new world, right?
Yeah.
And there's some folks saying, stop cramming it down my throat. We don't need this. We don't need quotas. Things were better in the olden days, right?
Yeah.
I get it. Oppression.
Sure.
I understand. And when you stand up for someone, the chances of the ire being directed at you are very high.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so you got part of that courage is also about your willingness to say, okay, I'm maybe not going to be everybody's best friend, right? And I know some men who are some amazing allies who philosophically, fundamentally believe in this stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
And yet even them face unconscious bias every day, right?
Yeah.
Even I do, right? And and that whole process of going through unpacking that power and privilege, and saying and moving the unconscious to the conscious, right? And then taking some action on that, right?
I'm just going to throw you what's probably to you a softball, but I think it needs to be thrown because it's a big part of the conversation right now with people like Jordan Peterson saying there is no such thing as white privilege, for example, that privilege is an illusion. We've talked a lot about privilege in the last 40 minutes or so, and I think it is a key aspect of understanding what on earth is going on. Mm-hmm. But it's also something that a lot of people are denying exists, whether it's male privilege or white privilege or the privilege of living in a Western country like Canada. Maybe this is too glib of a question, but if someone were to say to you, there is no such thing as white male privilege, what do you say to that?
I work with a guy who tells me that all the time. And he tells me I had to work for everything I have.
Right.
Right? And he tells me that. And I believe he did work hard for what he has, right? Mm-hmm. But I also know, the random studies by Harvard that do the blind, they send out 2 resumes.
Right.
This one's Jane and this one's John.
Yep.
And they are identical resumes, and John gets the call back every single time, and Jane doesn't, mm-hmm, right? Mm-hmm. And so whether we believe it exists or we don't,
the fact is
it exists, right?
Right.
And so John doesn't think it exists because John worked hard for every single line on that resume, mm-hmm, right? Mm-hmm. He worked really hard, mm-hmm, for everything he got to do there, right? But he got the call back.
Right.
Right? And so I don't discredit that some folks had to work really, really hard for what they have in this world.
Yeah, that's not even the point, really.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And so privilege isn't about most of the privileges I have and you have are actually things that you have no control over whatsoever.
Right.
Right? And so, if you had more than 10 books in your house growing up, you have privilege.
Right.
Because you were exposed to reading, and being exposed to books gives you a certain way of thinking, which
right,
gives you a certain way of
right,
seeing the world, right?
Right.
Well, there's a privilege, like all these privileges, if you spoke English at home as a first language, if
right,
you lived in a single family home, and those are all things you had zero control over.
So here's the next question that someone who says there's no such thing as privilege, and then you say that, here's often the follow-up question, and I don't know if it's the same in your experience, but you hear it all the time, which is, why should I be penalized because my parents had more than 10 books in the home? Why should I be penalized because my parents spoke English and took an interest in my education, whereas the guy next door had no such thing? Why should I be penalized and punished for such a thing?
It goes back to exactly the quote I talked about in the beginning. When you're accustomed to privilege, equality feels like oppression, right? And so when you say, why should I be penalized? You're not being penalized.
Yeah.
There is no oppression, right?
Right.
We get to each have access. John and Jane both get a call back for the interview.
Right.
Right?
Is that so wrong? When you see it from that perspective,
right,
is that so unfair?
Right. John's not being penalized,
mm-hmm,
for having 10 books in the home,
mm-hmm,
and Jane's not being penalized for being born without a penis.
And I don't think anyone in the meeting room, when there are allies making sure that a woman's voice is heard, I don't think that men are being penalized when that happens.
Right.
It would almost be as ridiculous as saying that when Jane gets a chance to speak because someone has helped her get there and someone has reinforced her and said, hold on, Ben, we're going to have Jane speak for a second. Mm-hmm. Do I then, Ben, should I feel oppressed? Should I feel like I've been punished for that moment? Well, I don't think so. Mm-hmm. Because if I had been interrupted while speaking, I sure as hell would have had the chance to continue, mm-hmm, whether or not someone stood up for me or not.
Right.
So from that perspective, how is it unfair?
Right.
And I think that's a pretty adequate answer to that question.
And you raise a really interesting, segue to probably one of the most, I think, fascinating unconscious biases that exist in this kind of academic realm, is called the competency-likability bias. And so the premise here is that, generally speaking, women in leadership, women can be competent or they can be liked, but they cannot be both.
Right.
Right. And so, and I've experienced this. I know hundreds of women who've experienced this. Incredibly competent, well established, amazing women who are doing amazing things are bitches.
Right.
Right?
Right.
Everybody hates them.
Mm-hmm.
Right? But or they're super nice and they're really easy to get along with and they don't shut you down and they're easy to talk to, don't get promoted.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And this bias is probably the one that, and I will tell you that I had this bias for years. I used to look at some of the senior, when I was a 20-year-old in the public sector, and I would look up at the echelons of power and I would look at the women who are in those seats and trying to find those role models. And I remember saying, oh my God, I don't want to be like any of them because they're all cranky. They're all like mean. They're all
right.
I don't want to be like that.
Right.
Right. Because, and so here's these incredibly competent, accomplished women who even I'm looking up and going,
No,
believing that they're not nice.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And yet, but then, the nice folks. And so probably some of the most interesting research that I spend a lot of time on is about this competency likability bias and the binary polarization that people are putting women into, which doesn't mean that all women are there. It also doesn't mean that there's not,
Absolutely. For our last couple minutes, just the last question, how do we overcome this? How do we, it's a bias that makes sense to me. Clearly, I think it would make sense to anybody, like common sense. I don't have to read the study. I don't have to have it explained to me. I get it immediately. So what do we do about it? How do we overcome this?
Yeah, well, I've already talked about the whole notion of active allies, right?
Sure.
And the whole notion of leadership. I think that I'm not a fan of quotas. I'm there on there, but I am a big fan of intentional hiring. Right? I think we have to put some intentional folks in some intentional positions.
And you're talking about asking someone to apply.
Right. That's right. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Or asking someone to take a position.
Right.
Right.
Do you think that there's validity to what's her name? The Facebook Sandberg. Mm-hmm. I can't remember her first name. I'm blanking. Sheryl Sandberg.
Lean in.
Lean in. Right. Which is, maybe I'm paraphrasing too much here. Which is essentially, ladies, it's time for you to raise your hand when an opportunity comes up, and do what men seem to be able to do, which is, go the extra mile. And if you only have 50% of the qualifications, apply anyways.
Right.
Do you think that there's validity to that in the mix of all of this? I'm sure there is, but do you think it matches up with this changing culture through active allies?
Yes, absolutely. I'm a big fan of her work. I'm a big fan of her, mantra and the philosophy and all of those sorts of things, without doubt. But you are also fundamentally asking some women to change.
Right.
Right? It almost to me feels like in some cases it's almost the blame the victim mentality, right? Mm-hmm. Which is, don't expect all these men to make space for you. Cram your way in there and take the space.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And some folks who have that kind of personality can do that. Sheryl Sandberg was able to do that, right? And she took the space, right? Yeah. She claimed it. And, God bless her, she's done some amazing work. And she's a great role model, right? And in my competency likability bias, you will hear lots of people say not some very, very nice things about her and how much they don't like her, right?
Right.
Because she's not nice, right? Because she's mean.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
As an example, right? And you can Google what people think about her.
And on the whole, with what she's achieved, really?
Exactly.
It's just, anyways.
Everyone agrees she's competent. We're not sure we like her, right?
Right.
Right. But anyway, so I'm with her, right? Mm-hmm. But I'm also of this other space that says this isn't just about women, right? This is also about men, right? And so I don't want this to be the women's problem. I want it to also be a human problem, right?
Yeah.
And so I want women to make space for women. I want women to support women. I want men to support women. I want men to make space for women. I want women to make space for men, right? Because, I'll also hear lots of times the reverse oppression,
Sure.
I went to the women's center and they weren't nice to me, says my male friend, right?
Yeah.
Or I sat on a board of directors with all women and, I felt oppressed. Or I went to Mexico, I know what it's like to be oppressed, the
Yeah, no,
right?
absolutely. Yeah.
And so I really like her message, but I also think there's not a silver bullet.
That's right.
There's not a one-stop answer. I think some women do that, some women do this, some women do this. And so I think all of it, right? And all of it needs leadership. So we need leaders like Sheryl Sandberg saying, I'm going to make space. I need leaders like Justin Trudeau saying, I'm going to make 50% of my cabinet women. I need leaders like that counselor who says we're going to do scaffolding regardless of political opinion, right? And so we need all of those different kinds of approaches for a multi-faceted approach, not because there is no silver bullet. And it's not that simple.
We're talking about changing culture, really. We're talking about generational change.
That's right.
Laurie, this has been a terrific conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time.
As always, Ben, thank you so much for having me.
You're welcome.
All right, that's the show. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen. Remember that you can get all previous episodes of this podcast at www.wogoshow.com. That's WOEGO show.com. The handle on social media is also WogoShow, and my email address is wogoshow@gmail.com. I would love to hear your feedback, your suggestions, and your ideas for future episodes. Without further ado, here is your quote of the week. It is from Sheryl Sandberg. In the future, there will be no female leaders. There will just be leaders. Thanks for listening. Hey, just a quick note to let you know that this show was originally broadcast on CFRC 101.9 FM in Kingston, Ontario, Canada, and that you can also catch it every Tuesday on CHMR in St. John's, Newfoundland. Thanks again.